Hello, everyone. This is Carl Lankowski of historic Chevy Chase DC, and you are viewing an event in the series we have staged since the beginning of the planning exercise launched early this year. That exercise aims to improve the built environment along Connecticut Avenue between Chevy Chase Circle and Livingston Street. This is a project central to historic Chevy Chase DC's core mission of caring for our streetscapes, even as they necessarily and inevitably evolve. Attention to neighborhood history allows us to articulate a vision we can be proud to bequeath to the next generation, one reflecting the values of inclusivity, civility, livability, and environmental sustainability. Historic Chevy Chase DC has already offered programs in this series that have examined previous planning episodes in DC, explored racial geography, and looked at the issue of affordable housing. Tonight, we take a major step forward by offering the first concrete view of how our Main Street might look in a 30-year projection. It implicitly balances the values articulated by our community this year and condenses them into a plausible picture. It is particularly sensitive to the affordable housing gap that grew as our city expanded its population by 100,000 new inhabitants since the year 2000. And it represents one response to our acknowledgement of Chevy Chase DC's connection to the rest of the city and our desire to contribute to improving our city overall, especially as we organize a generational effort to decarbonize our society as foreseen by the 2015 Paris Agreement. In the spirit in which Henslowe offered his stage to Burbage so that Will Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet could be performed in the film Shakespeare in Love, historic Chevy Chase DC gives its stage tonight to Ward 3 Vision. Advocates of smart growth, Ward 3 Vision has worked up the projection you will see in the coming moments. We are lucky to have three talented panelists this evening. Noted architect and designer Matt Bell undertook the work pro bono, a bold and generous effort. It is offered not as a definitive statement, but as a point of departure for serious deliberation by all members of our community. Matt is fellow of the American Institute of Architects and a professor at the University of Maryland and a principal at Perkins Eastman in Washington, DC. We welcome back Ellen McCarthy, the former director of the DC Office of Planning, who has been a resident of the Chevy Chase Gateway area for more than 30 years. She'll start us off by offering a comment to put the presentation in the context of the Chevy Chase Small Area Plan. Matt will make the initial presentation of about 30 minutes. We hope for and expect a lively discussion to follow. Also joining us is Ron Eichner, who is standing by to engage in the discussion following the slide presentation. Ron is a longtime resident of Chevy Chase DC. Once an architect and urban designer, he is currently an urban infill developer. An advocate for smart growth, he is a member of the Champions Council for the Coalition for Smarter Growth and on the steering committee of Ward 3 Vision. So we welcome your comments and questions. Please type them into the Q&A box. Discussion will be facilitated by Chaz Cadwell of Historic Chevy Chase DC, who is also producing this event. We'll conclude at 8:45 p.m. This Zoominar is being recorded and will be available for viewing within a few days using a link you will find on the HCCDC website and also on the Ward 3 Vision website. Finally, a word to remind you that there is a survey at the end of our presentation this evening. And we very much encourage you to take a moment, only take a couple of minutes, to look at and respond to the 9 questions therein. It'll help us in our future program. And with that, Ellen McCarthy, the screen is yours.
Let's see. Oh. Okay. Thank you, Carl. A very brief introduction to the presentation that Matt is about to make. Basically, we were hearing a lot of frustration about the Chevy Chase small area plan process, with people saying that the discussion was too abstract and they wanted to see what a plan might actually look like in reality. So one Sunday afternoon, a few neighbors got together and we walked the study area from the Circle to Legation on both sides of Connecticut Avenue. We looked at vacant or underutilized spaces that could be redeveloped to provide more diverse housing options and more customers to support the shops. And this concept is what has emerged. So maybe the best intro to this presentation is to say what it's not. It is not the Chevy Chase small area plan. It's a concept of how the properties along the avenue might change over a period of many years, assuming that the owners of the properties are willing to redevelop them or sell them to people who are able to make changes. But most of all, we hope that this will be a useful tool for you residents and business owners to see some of the possibilities and decide what you like or don't like, and bring that knowledge to the design workshop, also known as a charrette, which the Office of Planning contemplates as the next major step for us all to help shape the future of Chevy Chase Gateway through the small area plan. That plan can contain guidelines or zoning changes to make sure that the future development conforms to what it is that we want to see. I also wanted to put in just a brief word about Ward 3 Vision. We're an all-volunteer group of Ward 3 residents. A few years ago, we saw promising opportunities for positive additions to the ward, like the redevelopment of the former Outer Circle Theater on Wisconsin Avenue, get turned into nothing more than a drive-through bank, partly because potential developers feared anti-development opponents would scuttle more ambitious plans. We saw that there was a need for those of us who knew we could demand high-quality development beneficial to the ward, that there was a need for us to band together and speak up. Unlike what you might have heard, we do not have, quote, developer money. In fact, we have no money. We depend on our fellow Ward 3 residents to give their time and energy to study the issues, prepare testimony, and in the case of Matt Bell, to donate their considerable talents to make our Ward 3 neighborhoods even better. And now, Matt Bell.
Over to you, Matt.
Great. Good evening. Thanks, Ellen. Thanks, Carl. I think the best way to begin is to jump in with what we want to talk about, because we know there'll be a lot of interesting discussions. So let me share my screen here. And I'm hoping people can see my screen. Is that true?
Yes, we can, Matt.
Okay, great. So what Carl said is true. We want to walk through a vision that Ward 3 Vision has put together for a 30-year vision for Chevy Chase. And I think this is an aerial view that'll be familiar to everybody. Clearly, you can see Connecticut Avenue in the middle there, Chevy Chase Circle in the bottom, and then it's sort of extending south into the district. Let's take a second and just talk about what is the context of the community. We have in Chevy Chase DC a variety of uses. We have residential, commercial, some institutional uses. We have some quite distinctive architecture. We have diverse building types from small houses to inline retail, large apartment buildings. We have also some large retail buildings like the Safeway, and we have an eclectic range of architectural styles. And these are probably shots that are familiar to everybody who's following on tonight. One of the challenges, though, today is that recent events are, of course, challenging in many respects some of the vitality of retail in Chevy Chase DC. And these are some recent pictures on the top row here where we have stores or restaurants that are either closed or temporary closed, or retail businesses that have closed and left the area, and ones like the diner that were never all that attractive to begin with, at least in my opinion. And some, what is needed in this sense, when we think about the context for retail along Connecticut Avenue, is more community members who can walk to and patronize those businesses along Connecticut Avenue and sustain the vitality of place and of open space. More of the picture on the bottom, like we see at the Little Beast there, and local residents. What that means is new local residents who are within walking distance, and it means that folks can patronize these businesses by walking there without having to drive, and therefore retail relies less upon the automobile to sustain itself. And that's a really important thing to remember today in terms of the context of what the neighborhood's all about. I also want to touch, before we get into the vision here, the concept idea about height. We have tall and old and new buildings and tall and short buildings in Chevy Chase. And what we've done with these diagrams to give people a little sense of context is shown all the different sides of the street from Livingston to the Circle. And we're showing the heights of buildings approximately as they are today. And what Ward 3 Vision is saying should be considered is heights up to 65 and 75 feet along Connecticut Avenue. And that's important to understand in the context of buildings that already exist. For example, the top line is the approximate height of 5333, a new recent residential building south of Chevy Chase DC, 110 feet. And then some of the buildings just south of Livingston are at about a 90-foot height, and they're multifamily buildings as well. So we want to give a context of what it is the Ward 3 Vision is really proposing in terms of how we move forward with a vision. So this is now the west side between McKinley, Northampton, and Chevy Chase Circle here. You can see all the way there what that would mean. And then the east side here, coming from the north-south to the south between Chevy Chase Circle, Northampton, and McKinley, including the library and the community center. There you can see the context of what Ward 3 Vision is seeing in terms of height. On the east side from the Safeway down to Livingston there as well. So again, putting it in context of 5330 and some of the other taller buildings. And also as a kind of context, we also took the liberty of taking the 4 goals that were identified by the visioning sessions by OP and trying to elaborate a little bit from our point of view, what are the tools that can help us achieve some of these goals that have been identified in visioning sessions, and how does one apply these things? So what we've done is we've made 4 categories. What's the goal? What is the strategy as part of that goal? And these can overlap as well. What are the objectives that one can use to realize that goal and strategy? And what are the specific tactics that one might deploy to be able to realize them? So I'm not going to walk through the whole chart. This will be available on the Ward 3 Vision website if people want to take a look at it and comment. But I just want to point out a couple of things along in the bottom 2 categories. Everybody on this webinar knows we're facing a crisis in terms of climate in the world, not just Chevy Chase DC. And so we really want to focus on environmental sustainability. So for us, what that means is compact development and walkable development at transit-rich locations like the Connecticut Avenue corridor, and building sustainably. What that also means is building in places where there already are settlement patterns. So filling in with increased density along Connecticut Avenue, which will have, by virtue of that, reduced car use and increase in transit use and alternative modes. Instead of sprawling out into the suburbs like we see so often in our world, where the only way people can get around is to drive, they can't even walk to the store or to a restaurant. We think that infill along Connecticut Avenue makes a lot of sense from an environmental and climate change point of view. And then, of course, the tactics would be larger buildings, perhaps near the Circle, make standards for new development for energy, and also make sure that there's good parameters for public space design. Also, we know that social equity is an important part of the formula moving forward. We learned last week in Commissioner Chang's session about the need for equitable housing and more affordable housing in the neighborhood. And we think that in addition to just considering density, that this has to be part of a range of housing options for people of all ages and all income levels. So for example, one could imagine living in Chevy Chase DC as a young homeowner, and then also retiring there and living out the sort of different stages of our life in a range of housing options. We think that there are sites that can do this for us, such as the community center and the library site, that could be developed with affordable housing, and probably include inclusionary zoning for affordable housing on other sites as well. It's also important to realize, so that's just some of the sort of way we think about this sort of goals and strategies. What I think is also important is some of these things, are things that the community should debate as they move on. So for example, smaller development parcels might encourage more variety, but it might mean less efficient buildings, and there might be fewer shops and homes along the avenue. So that's something to sort of work through with the Office of Planning. Or even if you have pitched roofs as a guideline, that might seem more attractive. It may mean less possibility to do green roofs or photovoltaics on the roof and things like that. So those are things that could be considered as part of the small area plan. I also want to point out, from our point of view on the social equity line, we're not ruling out that there might be other ways of developing private sites. That the only way to do it is through private developers. We think that nonprofits, community land trusts, and whatever could be part of this as well. We're just listing what we believe is a likely scenario in terms of moving forward, and with a range of price points. So what models are best? We think traditional city streets offer designer good precedents for placemaking. These are some images that we think could guide our thinking as we move forward. We need buildings that define the public realm and define great streets and places. We have some of that in Chevy Chase DC. It's a little bit fragile. We have some of it, but we need active and welcoming ground levels, places that have scale and architecture that people like, human scale elements like storefronts, windows, balconies. And we really want to make sure that as we move forward in the small area plan, we're avoiding the kind of architecture that is out of scale and out of overly abstract in terms of the neighborhood. So these are some different kinds of infill development we've looked at. We think the scale of these buildings is appropriate. We think architectural expression might vary, but the contemporary buildings could be mixed in with more traditional buildings, and that's something we think could be really define a very active and varied streetscape. But the most important thing of any building that gets built along Connecticut Avenue is what it does at the street level and how it engages us as pedestrians and community members. So,
Matt, could I interrupt you for a moment?
Sure.
There's a question about whether, if you go back 2 slides, whether the buildings in that looking ahead, are those, what's the height of those?
Oh, let's see. On the upper right is probably to the top of the building is probably 60, 65. It has a setback. It has 4 stories there. On the left side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's probably 60, maybe 65 feet on the left side because it has a tall retail ground level. Lower left there is 1, 2, 3, 4 stories, probably 50 feet. There's a variety of the stuff in the lower right there. So these are between 50, 65, might be as close to 70 if in the upper right, the building that's in the background there.
Great.
Does that help?
Thank you for that question. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So existing conditions. So what we want to walk through is just ideas we have about how this could actually go forward as a concept in Chevy Chase DC. So you see a map of the neighborhood on the left side with Chevy Chase Circle in the upper left, and then Connecticut Avenue sort of cutting diagonally through it. And on the right, we're going to use a series of aerial photos you can see with the Avalon in the middle there, and you can see the Chevy Chase Library and Community Center for orientation, and the street in the bottom is Livingston. So we'll use these graphics to sort of articulate what we're showing as a vision. So the big idea really is to see the north end as kind of a gateway district, could have public uses, obviously the community center and the library and public spaces, perhaps at the community center as well, perhaps taller buildings, and we'll show perhaps up to 75 feet there. And at the lower end, the Main Street district really focusing on retail, existing structures, and a more modest scale of infill development. What we're showing in blue are the sites, and this will become clearer as we, in the next couple of slides, we're saying there's opportunity sites that should be considered for redevelopment. So the next slide shows really what I just mentioned. In blue are the opportunity sites, and we're saying as part of the concept, in yellow would be the sites to remain. So the block between Livingston and Morrison, from the Starbucks to the bank, we say, this probably should remain, but maybe the parking lot behind the bank should be a candidate for redevelopment. The next block up, we're saying the middle part should be retained, but we think the CVS and the diner site perhaps are candidates for redevelopment. The Avalon block we think is a pretty good block, keep that. And we think there are other sites further north of there up to the Long and Foster building that ought to be considered for redevelopment. And we think most of the areas along the east side should be candidates for redevelopment as well. And I'll walk through each of those. So this is the northernmost 5700 block. here, Long and Foster and the Wells Fargo blocks. You all might know them by those names. They're articulated in green in the plan there. And we're saying that the Gateway District might be a little bit challenging for retail at the ground floor. So we think active uses at the ground floor might be things like city services, history center, library uses, post office, things like that, kids play areas. And on the west side, multifamily buildings with retail or other uses on the ground floor, up to about 75 feet or wherever the max is under the flum, and then sort of decrease height at the west and transition via townhouses or height transitions to the single family house neighborhoods to the west. And on the east side, we think the multifamily could have underground parking, again, up to 75 feet. And again, transitioning to townhouses to the east with the single family districts on the streets to the east. So that's the 5700 book. So we're showing sort of what it's like today and a little bit of what we kind of conceptual idea of how that might look like over 30 years time. So 5600 block is the next block down. That's the Avalon block and the library and the community center there. And we're saying that the opportunity sites are the library and the community center and the parking lot behind the Avalon and Magruder's there. And we're saying there on the west, gentle density, perhaps townhouses or other things that step down to the single family house neighborhoods to the west. And on the east, the community center and library could be rebuilt as affordable housing as part of it, with new community resources of the community center and the library, underground parking, and perhaps the civic plaza. We're showing a sort of diagram of that in the middle there. So you can see there's perhaps a way that those programs could be interwoven together, and there could be community open space as part of that development. The next block down is the 5500 block, east and west. So you can see that here. And as I mentioned before, we're suggesting on the west side that the CVS and the parking lot behind it could be a redevelopment site, and that the diner site might be a redevelopment site as well. They're not big sites, but we think those are good candidates to be considered, as is the Safeway. And probably many of you are aware of the creative things that have been done with supermarkets throughout the city in terms of redevelopment, keeping the supermarket, but also having other kinds of development as part of it. So what we're saying here on the west side is, potentially multifamily stepping down to townhouses or buildings that, step down to the single family houses to the west, 3 to 4 story, perhaps live work buildings at the diner site, and potentially rebuilding Safeway up to 65 feet above, with retail at the ground floor stepping down to the east. You can see some townhouses that are sort of drawn there, stepping down to that neighborhood there, and potentially with retail as a rebuilding as part of that block. So that's the 5500 block. And now the 5400 block, which is the block with the PNC Bank and the Exxon station, and also the Starbucks on the corner of Livingston and Connecticut. And what we're suggesting here is we think over time, the block on the east side, which includes the Exxon station and Blue 44, is a good candidate for redevelopment. And on the west side, really the parking lot at the back of the bank is a place where one could do some very nice infill development. So we're showing townhouses on the west side, or something that steps down in height. It could also be multifamily, or even perhaps a small office building stepping down to single family there. And then on the other side of the street, we think that's a place where we could have a 65-foot tall multifamily stepping down to the east as it relates to the single family house neighborhoods on the other side of the site. So what we have here is a summary diagram of what we have been suggesting over the past couple of minutes, with the taller buildings at the gateway areas, the transition to the townhouses. We're noting that we think all the residential development really ought to include 10 to 20% affordable units. And we think that's a very, very achievable goal with a plan like this. We think there's a lot of good buildings that ought to remain and continue to be part of our community, but there are a lot of places for infill, as we're noting, on both sides of the street. We think the east side is probably a candidate more for some of these 65-foot tall buildings that could be developed as part of the whole block. there. And then the centerpiece of that side of the street being really the redevelopment of the library and the community center, and including affordable housing and civic space as part of that. And we note as well some of the 90-foot tall buildings just south of Livingston on Connecticut Avenue at the bottom of the slide. So that's really the overview of what we at Ward 3 Vision are contemplating as really something that could help to provide for a broader array of housing, could address some questions and goals about social equity in terms of different kinds of affordable housing that the city desperately needs. We think also it could go a long measure to doing our fair share for climate change in terms of building where there is already settlement and settlement patterns, and helping to reinforce retail and livability of walkable urbanism along Connecticut Avenue. We think that's an admirable goal, and we think it's achievable with a vision like this that could span over 30 years. So Chaz, I don't know if you want to open it to questions, or if there's anything Ellen and Ron want to add that I might have skipped over, but this is our slide here that we're ending with.
Sure, that's great. Thank you very much, Matt. You packed a lot into a very short amount of time. And, I know a lot of work went into doing that. I've got a host of questions myself, and I see a couple of questions collecting in the Q&A box. If we were doing this as a live event, we could have a room full of people with microphones, but we don't. And so we're constrained by the webinar format. So, but we do want to answer as many questions as we can, given the array of experts we have with us tonight. And so let me just ask the first question, Matt, and that is, where are people going to park?
Where are people going to park? That's an excellent question. One of the things that we've observed happening in neighborhoods that infill like this is that when you bring more people living within walking distance to a neighborhood, you oftentimes have less of a need for parking for retail, because more people can walk there. But on the other hand, also with redevelopment comes considerations about other modes of parking. So one of the things that might be considered is underground parking. We have a lot of surface parking right now in the neighborhood. It could be that, you know, as part of these projects, as these projects are redeveloped, residential and projects could have some spaces in them for retail to support the retailers. And we think that that's something that really ought to be considered as part of the small area plan. Retail does need parking. There is parking along Connecticut Avenue. And we think there ought to be a way that parking that can serve the retail as well should be sustained within the plan. I don't know if Ron and Ellen want to chime in on that. But.
Yeah, Ellen and Ron, if you could turn on your cameras and unmute yourselves, you can join the conversation here.
No, I think Matt is absolutely correct. These the new buildings would be more urban than the history of buildings in the area, and they would have underground parking.
Have you? This is your concept, so this isn't a plan. It's more of a vision, and even if the district were to adopt something like this, it still depends on people investing money to, including the district perhaps, but investing money to realize this over whatever period. But the picture you've got here, how many additional residents is that for Chevy Chase DC? Have you got any sense of that?
Go ahead, Ron.
That certainly depends a lot on how these parcels actually get developed. But if it were all built out tomorrow, and if all the ground floors of the larger structures were non-residential floors, retail or public uses, then there are probably around 750 units of housing at a 900 square foot average. And I apologize for getting really wonky and nerdy about it, but you know, you just have to, that's how you estimate it, just by taking the gross square footage and dividing it by some average. Now, if the units were larger for either family units for affordable housing or more upscale large units for luxury units, then there'd be fewer units. So
We've got a lot of questions about why you've got the tall buildings up toward the circle, and the density seems out of proportion to the people's expectations about what would be acceptable in the neighborhood. How does, in the development of a small area plan, how do those things get worked out? This may be a process question, I suppose, but how does the neighborhood's sense of this get taken into account? Maybe it's a question for you, Ellen.
Yes, that's a great example of why we wanted to do this plan, because when we looked at the avenue, it seemed like we already have that tall historic apartment building that's by Blessed Sacrament, and Long and Foster, which is a taller building. And so it made sense as the gateway into DC coming from Maryland, going through the circle. It makes sense to have taller buildings there. There's a lot of institutional uses, as not as much single family right there. And then to scale down in size. But that's exactly the kind of thing that will be discussed when the Office of Planning does the charrette or the design workshop, is people can then weigh in and say, yeah, it's a great idea, put the tall buildings there, or no, that's too tall, or yeah, it's okay to be tall, but step it down to no more than this height on the backside. It's basically here to be food for thought and discussion.
Thank you. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, no, the point I would make is that would be something to look at with Office of Planning. We thought the taller buildings were better located up closer to Chevy Chase Circle. But, I mean, that's something people could discuss. I mean, we think 65 is a very reasonable and compatible height for the bulk of the center of the vision.
I would add,
the current height limit is what, 40 feet?
Something like that, yeah.
I would add that part of the reason for that is just the space of the circle itself. There are not tight urban streets up there. It's more expansive, which is generally a good kind of environment for a taller building. The apartment building Ellen referred to up by Blessed Sacrament, that's probably a 70-foot building from the sidewalk, and it fits perfectly fine at the circle. So that's a part of where that thinking came from.
Can I ask a question that I'm not sure if anyone's asked on the screen here yet, but it may capture a lot of what people are worried about. Several years ago, historic Chevy Chase DC developed an idea for a historic district in an area wider than the small area plan, but including that area. And my question is not so much about what would that have done vis-a-vis this small area plan, but how do other design and development restrictions interact with the small area plan? Can there be a historic district and a small area plan? Are there things like zoning overlays, or what are ways to make sure that whatever you've drawn these vague gray buildings, but what can assure that they don't totally change the nature of the neighborhood?
Well, there's a couple ways. Obviously, one thing is to have design review. If it was a historic district, any building that would be built there would be subject to review by the Historic Preservation Review Board, which I sit on currently. There are other models. I don't know, Ellen, do you want to speak to other models too?
Well, in the revision of the zoning regs in 2016, the possibility was created to create individual zones. So we could have a special Chevy Chase Gateway zone that could have different requirements for stepping down. It could have different requirements for ground floor retail, could change the parking requirements. That would all be part of, once we have the visioning session or the design workshop and have a plan in mind for the small area plan, then part of the small area plan can be the implementation section, where we talk about specifically how do we achieve the vision that people have agreed upon.
And different district bodies and or the ANC have different amounts of voice in those different processes. I guess my question really is, where does the community get to be involved as this evolves, not just at this small area plan stage?
Oh yeah, for new development to take advantage of the additional height, there can be regulations that require either each building would have to do that as a planned unit development, in which case the community weighs in on the design and benefits of each building before the zoning commission and the advisory neighborhood commission gets automatic standing as well. Or there could be a requirement that to achieve the extra density, which is now permitted under the changes in the comp plan, the new future land use map, that taking advantage of that of the new density would require certain additional steps to be taken. So, however, there's no process that changes land use in the district that doesn't have substantial opportunities for public participation.
I would just add, I can't speak for the ANC, obviously, but I sat on the comp plan task force, and the process of amending the comp plan, the future land use map, and the comp plan, and having this small area plan this process is designed in order to maximize community input. So the community is intimately involved in this discussion that will result in a small area plan. And then when property owners come requesting upzoning or PUDs or whatever to build their buildings, the community then through the ANC will be involved in essentially negotiating with those property owners and developers on whether or not their proposals are consistent with the desires of the community as expressed in the small area plan. So there's the notion is really a lot of community involvement.
Matt, in one of your pictures about what things might look like, you had the sort of soft colors and looked like sunset, very warm, welcoming picture. But how do we guarantee that what gets done is actually quality and not, one of my working titles for this session was not Bethesda. How do we assure that we don't become Bethesda?
Yeah, Ellen alluded to it earlier. I mean, design review might be very important to this community and something that should be pursued. I mean, if Chevy Chase were to be a historic district, then, as I've said before, any building would have to both come to the ANC first and then to the Historic Preservation Review Board for review and commentary. Mm-hmm. And then there are other kinds of overlays that could require Office of Planning review, or ways in which projects could be incentivized to come to the zoning commission as a PUD, which would receive a level of design review as well. I think what you're talking about is by right development. Ellen and I did write a form-based code for Hill East, which is now being built out, which has an actual form-based code that talks about the kinds of architecture that should be built there. And it's in the zoning regulations for Hill East. And there's been, a rather large couple of buildings built as a first phase there. And that's another way to do it. It's actually part of the zoning regulations, right, Ellen?
Right.
One of the things that I've heard, I heard this in comments during Chevy Chase Day as well, when Office of Planning had a table among the many that were there. But people who, one of the reasons several of us, I think, are interested in the small area plan is because it might, in fact, create more affordable housing so that we share in reaching the district's overall affordable housing shortage. But a lot of people are skeptical that anything that gets built up here would ever be affordable. And so it's sort of two sorts of questions. One is, how does the city or the small area plan assure that there is affordability built into things? And I think you mentioned like 20%, but where's that number come from and who pays for it? Who subsidizes it? I guess that's my first question anyway. I know it's depends on lots of things, but how does this normally get worked out?
Let me briefly run through one way to look at this plan and think about affordable housing. The massing that's shown at the community center and library site right now, and that is would be a development on district-owned land. If the district subsidize the development of affordable housing in that location, and if the two wings that are shown as residential there were 100% affordable, that would be about 97 units at 900 square feet. Now, whether or not a building that's 100% affordable is a good decision or not is something, you know, the community will want to talk about among ourselves and with the district. I looked at the rest of this layout and assumed 20% of the residential units would be affordable at 900 square feet per unit, and got about another 160 affordable, 140 affordable units. So that would be in this layout, if it were all built at one time, about 225, 230 affordable units. And that assumes that all the development outside of the community center and library is private development subject to inclusionary zoning. There are other ways of developing, as Matt mentioned, nonprofit developers, community land trusts, that sort of thing, which would probably produce more affordable units, but that's we did not address how these blocks would be developed. Just looked at the massing and calculated the yield of affordable units. So about 230 affordable units across this scheme.
So Ron, does that imply that some private development, a condition of their approval would be that they include some affordable units in their unit as well?
Well, the district, that's already in place. The bare bones of that are already in place. First of all, inclusionary zoning is part of zoning. So any building with over 9 units of housing has to have a certain percentage, 10 or 12% affordable units. There's also something called inclusionary zoning plus, I believe what it's called. And what that says is that if any upzoning or PUD that is based on the increased densities under the future land use map, the revisions to the comprehensive plan, will be subject to an even greater percentage of affordable units. And in the numbers I just threw out at you, I said, let's assume 20%. So yes, that would be a requirement by the district of the private developers to provide affordable housing.
For those of us who aren't affordable housing experts, what's that mean in the district?
Ellen, correct me if I'm wrong. I think what the district means is up to 80% of the mean family income in rent. I mean, roughly, it attempts to cap rents at 30% of income.
Right. The Department of Housing and Urban Development sets what is the median income, well, based on the census, what is the median income, and then calibrates that for a family of four, of 3, 2, 1, different income levels for those, but the rent that can be charged is deemed no more than 30% of the income of the family. So it's uniform throughout the city.
Now, the opportunity here, a lot of people are interested in having deeper levels of affordability in Ward 3, which, Ward 3 Vision thinks is something obviously, yeah, that would be great. That is particularly great as those of us on the ANC Task Force on Racism noted that, since the median income of African Americans in the city is more in the 30 to 50% of average family income, that maybe there should be more targeting of that as a response to, the exclusionary zoning history of Ward 3. Those sorts of concerns, the ideal place to address them is in the community center and library, where the district will have more control over what happens, more control than on these privately owned sites.
I just add one.
That's getting in the weeds, but those are issues that can be discussed in the small area plan process.
Chaz, can I add one thought to that
Of course.
as well, just as a general thing? When you restrict housing development and don't build it, the price of existing housing goes up. So when we make it harder to build residential development in general, not just affordable, but in general, it raises the price of the existing housing stock. And so DC is still, it's a very, desirable place to live. So as people come, if we don't expand the amount of just housing, not just affordable, but housing in general, it drives the price up. It makes it less affordable for people. And so we end up with communities that people priced out of communities.
I would take the opportunity.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Chaz, if I could just add one thing to what Matt said, and I would take the opportunity here, as I think Matt alluded to earlier. We are concerned with affordable, capital A, officially affordable units, per the mayor's concerns about increasing the number of dedicated affordable units in Ward 3, but we're also concerned about just increasing options at various price points throughout the neighborhood, so that people at various stages of life and various income levels can afford to live in the neighborhood. Some of them will live in apartments and condos, some of them will live in single family houses, but everybody, I'm sure, on this call right now knows what's happening with prices of single family houses in this neighborhood. And the result of this ridiculous increase in prices is that fewer different kind of people can live here. So we think providing residential options for a variety of different family types and people at various stages in life is very important to maintaining the diversity and vitality of the neighborhood.
And can I just speak?
I want to ask a question about affordability at the other end, and that is whether in other small area plan introductions, what's the effect of the plan on properties adjacent to the plan, 3 blocks from the plan, half a mile from the plan, over what period, and what things go up? Do they go down? And therefore taxes go up or down? Is there any experience you can share on that?
I mean, how could prices go up anymore? That's what everybody everybody says. But there's many documented studies, academic studies, that areas nearby places that become more walkable and accessible increase in value. People want to live near places that become the sort of active, walkable places that we think is described in this plan.
So maybe not right behind the future Safeway site, but a few houses away might indeed be more valuable.
Well, but if you think about it, our neighborhood is full of $1.5 million plus houses that are immediately adjacent to the 90-foot apartment buildings along Connecticut Avenue. And it doesn't seem to have downgraded the desirability of those and the price of those houses.
And that's not just our neighborhood. I mean, this is historic Chevy Chase. I mean, if you look up and down Connecticut and Wisconsin, it is part of the urban pattern. Buildings that address the avenues are big, and often as not, they come right up against single-family houses next to it. You know, historically,
and we're suggesting a transition. We're suggesting a scale transition between the side streets and Connecticut Avenue, which I think is good planning and good design.
I totally agree. Back in the day, they didn't worry about that.
On your concept, you show a lot of pitched roofs without necessarily a lot of room for either rooftop entertainment or more appropriate to your environmental points, to solar and other and sort of more green roofs. Is that
we would encourage green roofs, rooftop entertainment, and solar. This is a graphic. This is just a graphic, really.
Understood. But my question is really whether that's the sort of thing, sort of detail that would go into a small area plan.
It could. I mean, if the community feels that that's an important thing that they want to represent, you know, there was some questions in the chat I saw about pitch roofs and solar panels and, you know, penthouses and things. You know, of course, the DC has occupiable penthouses now that might be taken into consideration. We're talking about buildings up to the street wall. There might be a setback for a penthouse, but that's the sort of thing people could weigh in on, and Office of Planning could put it in the small area plan to show examples of the kind of architecture and massing that would be part of the plan.
What your concept doesn't have is separate annexes about transportation or even much detail about public space. But what about transportation? If we've got all this density and there's no, you know, there's the buses that go downtown and one or two that go across town, but no metro and no parking. Where does the city catch up with the small area plan?
Well, go ahead, Ellen.
The small area plan, what we've proposed here was just mostly a sort of urban design concept of just showing where there were opportunities for development. The small area plan will look at transportation, environmental issues, schools, and other infrastructure. The Office of Planning, a plan has to be holistic, or as one of my favorite urbanists, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, said, urban planners have been tormented by the realization that everything relates to everything. So it will definitely take a broad look. I know that we have had discussions among ourselves about the value of having shuttles, high levels of bus service that would either take people down Connecticut Avenue to, to Van Ness, or out to Friendship Heights, or both, which would definitely discourage the need reduce the need for parking and encourage people to use transit.
The school thing is, I want to put a PS in there about that. In my experience, multifamily buildings generate very few school-age children. That may be changing somewhat. It's something that the community should put to the Office of Planning as a question. There was some things I noticed in the question about, you know, would this impact over what people feel are overcrowded schools and things like that. And Ellen's right, it would be part of the comprehensive plan for this. Typically, single family houses generate many more school age children than do multifamily buildings. But I believe that's something that the Office of Planning tracks and can look at and work with DCPS to get the community's answers on that.
Right. I was a member of the school boundary task force several years ago that redrew school boundaries for the first time in 40 years. I don't think we will wait 40 years for the next redrawing of school boundaries, but I think what people aren't fully aware of is as different neighborhoods change and lose children or gain children, the city always has the option to redraw the boundaries or to build new schools, not necessarily right in Chevy Chase, but someplace else where there's land available, and then redraw the boundaries for that school. So the district, I think, is well aware of the fact that our Ward 3 schools are getting more and more crowded, and they're already looking at how to deal with that issue. So it's not a reason not to make it possible for people to have housing choices that are not just $1.5 million single family houses in Chevy Chase. It's a reason to solve the school overcrowding problem, but those two are not what's the word I want? They don't exclude, solving one does not exclude solving the other.
I think it's important to remember that we're trying to look ahead for 30 years now. This is not all going to get built tomorrow. And as approvals are requested and proposals are made, we fully expect the school issue to be one that not just this community and this small area plan needs to grapple with, but the district and is going to have to grapple with it moving forward. And if school capacities are not there, likelihood is that things will not get built. But it's not a specific issue. We didn't design this proposal to fit the schools. The district's going to have to come through as this moves forward. I would just add to Carl's question, other kinds of studies that we think the small area plan absolutely needs to do or at least pave the way for, is design guidelines for the ground floors of these buildings. You can't build blank walls, and you can't build the kind of unfriendly storefronts that you get when you have a CVS every block, or the Safeway's blank wall. You have to have active uses. You have to have spaces that are conducive to the kind of retail that we want. So there really needs to be guidelines for development of the ground floors. There also needs to be a public space plan. A fabulous opportunity here are these wide sidewalks that we're blessed with on Connecticut Avenue, and with a new consistent wide sidewalk from Livingston up to the Circle on the east side, with some sort of civic space in the middle, similar on the west side. What's the most creative thing we can do with those spaces? What's the greenest way we can develop those sidewalks? It is like a blank slate and just an incredible opportunity. Ellen mentioned the transportation. Should we have dedicated bus lanes? Should we have bike lanes? Should we slow traffic on Connecticut or speed traffic on Connecticut up? These are all questions that a transportation plan might address, and those are critical aspects of the ultimate small area plan. There should be a programming and management plan for the avenue. Maybe that's that sits in the bailiwick of the Main Street office. I'm not sure, but we should talk about it. What can happen? Should there be a farmer's market on Connecticut Avenue? Should if there's going to be a civic space there, how is it animated with public uses. So these are all things that really still need to be addressed in order to really have a complete small area plan.
So Ron, one thing I would add is there's a public health component here too. People will walk on streets that have more continuous street frontage. If you imagine, probably many people on this webinar have been to Paris, and it's such a wonderful city to walk around in. And one of the reasons for that is because the streets have continuous storefronts and detail and things to look at as you walk past them. And I think that people will walk more if there's more of a walking environment, and it has very positive public health benefits.
You guys have done a great service with your drawing here, and you've got all these buildings. And so what you've drawn, though, is basically what would end up being a set of permissions that property owners, whether they're developers or existing owners or whatever, could do something. A small area plan would say something that's at this scale or this whatever other constraints come into it. It gives a small area plan as a way of changing the permissions of what can be built in this area. At the same time, it has a lot of details about how that gets done and the process and these various things you've been talking about. But if you were to look at some of the any of these spots where they'd be upzoned dramatically, the city is not going to take the property from somebody who's there already, are they? And if so, you know, do these neighborhoods who are in a small area plan develop sort of haphazardly, or how do these things evolve over the 30-year period you're thinking about?
I think the answer is the assumption that we made is that other than the community center and library, this is all private sector, you know, private development. Could the city come in and purchase one of these sites to build something else? Sure, but we would think that the something else they build should still be within the suggestions of the massing that we're putting here, and even more importantly, should adhere to those ground floor guidelines so that it is a lively neighborhood no matter who owns the building, no matter what uses are above the ground floor.
So that the district doesn't have ownership rights, but they do have development rights that they control.
Regulatory rights.
Right. And so if the small area plan is developed, it doesn't look this way by 2025 or something.
So one of the things I think is important to recognize with the planning process is that, because I've done a number of these when Ellen was planning director, we did a number of them together. And I've been on both sides, been working also for the regulatory bodies, but also for private developers and things. And one of the things that's really important to keep in mind with a master plan like this, a small area plan, is that nobody gets everything they want. And everyone holding hands and singing is very difficult to achieve. But what I have experienced that's very rewarding is that people participate honestly and share their interests and recognize that not everybody gets everything. They will get something that is highly valued to them. And I think what we're trying to put out here is what's highly valued to us. Now, not everybody would probably not everybody on this webinar would agree, but I think there's a lot of things in here that people would find of value. And I think it would be a mistake for people to believe that everyone's going to agree upon everything. But I think people should see what's important to them: public space, retail, the new library, the new community center, affordable housing, and figure out how that goes into the constellation of the possible here. Because I think that it's a tremendous opportunity for the city and for the neighborhood to really make a transformational change that'll be a good change for generations, not just, the near future, but we're saying well into the future.
And so the small area plan process is ongoing. And I think the schedule anyway has ending at the end of this year, which is essentially tomorrow. They've got these design charrettes that are scheduled at some point. I don't know if they're on the calendar yet, or how expansive they'd be. But the point you just made, Matt, that not all of us are going to agree with what comes out, but how do we, once we sit through that design process, is there a draft that's circulated, or what do people see, or what's the process after that input period? Or Ellen, you might know this too, been in the Office of Planning.
Yeah, typically what the Office of Planning has done, those of you that came to Chevy Chase Day saw the input that the Office of Planning got from the citizens through the series of visioning processes that they held that were Zoom meetings. They found a very high degree of consensus among people's goals and objectives, and that excuse me, the Office of Planning then incorporates that into a draft document. People are free to comment on that. The OP was handing out a copy of that at Chevy Chase Day. They have it on the website, the Office of Planning website, which is listed on the last slide on the presentation here. And the small area plans are generally adopted, sent by the Office of Planning after they get all the comments back and make whatever revisions they think are responsive. Then it also gets sent to the council, and the council has a public hearing as well, and can adopt the plan, could send it back to the Office of Planning and ask for changes, but generally by the time that a plan reaches the city council, there's enough support that the plan is adopted by the council.
I've been to Paris, but I've never been to a charrette. What actually happens?
Well, I think I haven't been part of the planning in these things, but my suggestion for folks is really to come prepared to share their best thinking, look at design precedents, look at places, have a good idea of places they like, that they think Chevy Chase ought to be like, places they visited that they think are good models there, have a list of the things they like about the place, have a list of the things that they think could be better. But also recognize that not everybody is going to have 100% consensus. What you're really trying to do is get to a good working consensus on a number of issues. And I think when you have that, I think a lot can be achieved.
There's a lot of questions here, and I hope I've got the essence of a lot of them conveyed to our panel. But one of the things that strikes me is, and I haven't asked each and every question, is just the great concern about the scale and the volume of what you've designed here as for those of us who've lived here for decades, a very dramatic change. Some of us are old enough, it probably won't happen during our lifetimes, but this is your concept. It's not the Office of Planning's concept. And the process that they are going through it doesn't start with the concept you've had, but this is a way of helping all of us think about what the small area plan will be words on paper, but it will eventually describe what's allowable of things like this, I suppose. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think remember the most important thing about a building in terms of what we experience is what happens at street level. So having a good idea about the scale and the character of a building at street level is very, very important, because that's what makes streets pleasurable to walk down. We're showing a very broad kind of concept here. I think it would be smart for the community to sit with OP and say, well, how do we get the kind of design that we want? I've seen a number of questions in the questions and in the chat about, well, how do we get small scale development and things like that? I think, you should explore regulatory ways that there could be design review for projects in this neighborhood that could let people weigh in and see what people are actually proposing and have the ability to comment on it. I do think that more density and more people living in Chevy Chase will not only afford, as I mentioned before about climate change and greater housing opportunities, but it'll also help support the retail and the streetscape along it. And there was a comment in here that we didn't really show much about the streetscape. We think there's a lot of good models that the community should pursue with OP about what that streetscape should be like. Ron mentioned it as well, but I think that's a real opportunity.
I want to wrap up in a moment because we're getting to the end of our time, but I want to give each of you a chance for any final comments you have.
Ladies first.
I think basically what we hope is that this concept plan has helped engage people and helped engage their thinking about the fact that, no cities are always changing and Chevy Chase will change. And the question is, how do we want to manage that change? In what direction? What do we want it to look like over time? So I hope that it has engaged your thought process and you bring those thoughts and yourselves to the charrette or the planning process that the Office of Planning will be doing at a date as yet not announced, but there's a lot of good questions and issues to be discussed, and we really need people's participation in order to get the best thinking of all those, many heads put together to come up with the best thinking for the future of Chevy Chase.
Ron, any last points?
I would just, two things. First of all, Chaz and Carl, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to do this. And Matt, thank you for all this, all this work. I would just add that, some of us have been talking about this for a couple of years now, and very much in the abstract. But once we started to look at this and visualize it, I for one, was extremely excited because I think there's an opportunity to enhance the avenue in a way that is very consistent with the neighborhood. If you look at this drawing of Matt's and you look along the west side there, where those are all like 3-story buildings, very modest structures, bigger than the bungalows, but not bigger than a lot of the houses in the neighborhood. And that's the transition to the avenue. If we can, massage and tweak the west side in a similar way, this will be an easy infill and a real change for the better in the community. So I'd like to thank Matt and his
Ron,
team for this.
Ron,
it's beautiful.
Ron, could you move to the last slide?
Matt.
Matt, rather, yeah.
Yeah, well, I just want to add 2 cents to there for a final thought. I think this is Chevy Chase DC's opportunity to think globally and act locally. I think it's a chance for the community to do what it can about social equity and housing opportunities, a chance to sort of take a stab at what we can do to combat climate change, and a chance to build a better community that it's not sprawling out into the suburbs, but it's reinforcing and enhancing what's already good about a place. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity to really make transformational change that's not to be missed.
Thank you. I want to, as we wrap up, I want to explain a couple of things. One is that we've got a 9-question survey that when you leave the webinar will appear in your web browser, and asking questions about what we didn't cover tonight that we should have, what you think is good or bad about the small area plan, and a couple of other questions. And if you could complete that, it would really help us both with input into the planning process, but also in thinking about future events between now and D-Day for a small area plan. Second is that the video of this event will be available on our website in a few days' time. But I also want to then just close by thanking our panel tonight. A lot of work gone into preparing what you've done, but also in making yourselves available to share this with the neighbors. And also, I do want to thank the audience. We had a couple hundred people sign up for this event, well over 100 who attended. And I especially want to thank those who volunteered and made contributions to Historic Chevy Chase DC so that we can keep doing events like this. Carl, anything else I should bring before the group?
Yeah, no, I had the privilege, I thought, of thanking everybody, but in the words of the dirt farmer that followed William Butler Yeats in his maiden speech to the dial as the Irish Free State was being set up in the early 1920s, after the eloquence of Yeats, the dirt farmer rose and said, "Aye, you took the words right out of me mouth." And so I wanted to thank the panel for a very good discussion that achieved all the purposes that we had in mind. To reiterate Chaz's thanks to the participants for inciting us to deeper insights about where we're going with all this. To remind everybody to take the survey, and finally, to look for and participate in tomorrow's event that Connie Chang, our commissioner, ANC commissioner, has reminded us in the chat, is running tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and it's about creative space, use of creative space. So with that, thank you. We're adjourned.
Thanks.